the great religion, that it had been hijacked.
Well, none of them believed in it. He said it.
And he said it repeatedly.
Exactly.
People forget that there was, that part of that idealism came out of it really came from him, from his heart. I think Bush gets a bad rap for being an evil person. I don't think he was that. I think he was largely an incompetent president, but he was a person who had a good heart, and it showed on Africa. He tripled PEPFAR, which is the program for the AIDS
and
program,
malaria. Right.
Obama is now presiding over an America that is more strapped for cash. So he is going to be looking stingy. I mean, this is going to be a big theme of American foreign policy for the next 10 years. We are going to be very constrained fiscally because of what is happening at home domestically. I think that the growth numbers, the projections that the administration has made are likely to be quite rosy.
Well, said another way is how do you create growth without adding overwhelmingly to the deficit?
Right, and how long can you do it? I mean, I don't, this debate that keeps taking place between the deficit hawks and the stimulus people. Let's say you do another stimulus. Let's say Paul Krugman is right and that we needed a larger stimulus. He wanted a stimulus that's about $400 billion.
He probably was right at the beginning.
He may have been right, but here's the question, Charlie. Suppose you spend that money now. Suppose you had spent it then. Then what? At some point, the money runs out and the private sector has to start investing and hiring, right? The government can't just keep spending this money unendingly.
Why do you think they haven't started investing and hiring?
The first reason they're not investing is because there is no demand for products. And certainly no demand for products that would require them to build new factories. In other words, they could use their existing factories to produce enough. So no businessman is going to pass up the opportunity to make money because he doesn't like Barack Obama. But it is certainly true.
Well, no, but you make an investment because you make a judgment about the future.
Right, and that's where I was getting to. So in the longer term, exactly, there's this sense of unease about where we're going with the debt, with healthcare reform, with financial regulatory reform. And I think that the Obama people have not thought that stuff through because, you can't, when you do the stimulus, what you're almost saying, to answer your fundamental question, why are we not getting the kind of growth we want? There's a certain sense in which we're trying to pump back the economy to get back to where it was 2006, 2007. But that was an economy fueled by absolutely unsustainable credit expansion. People were maxed out on their credit cards. They were maxed out on their mortgages. So Edmund Phelps, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, had a very good piece about this on the Times. He was saying, you can't pump back this economy to where it was. There is going to be a fallow period while more than anything else, individuals work out their balance sheets. They cannot get back to the debt levels.
And how long is a fallow period likely to be?
It's an interesting question.
And what electoral cycle will it coincide with?
It will not coincide with the next midterm cycle. I think we are going to have a longer period of sluggish growth than people realize, mainly because of that. You can't get back to where we were because where we were was unsustainable.
You know lots of heads of state, and you know lots of people who deal with heads of state. What's the assessment of President Obama by other leaders?
I think it's fair to say that with a few exceptions, there is no great overwhelming sense of respect, admiration, and all. I think that people think he's been a breath of fresh air. I think by and large they like the policies. Mm-hmm. I think if you look on foreign policy, personally he has not connected. And I think that's maybe two reasons. One, he has been consumed with economic issues. He's been consumed with them. People forget.
But that's a time when you have economic issues that you should be able to connect because it's a hackneyed phrase, but I feel your pain.
Yeah, but so much, I just mean in terms of the time spent. I mean, he had to cancel 2 trips to Indonesia, for example, right? So one of the ways you connect in these things is not at those large ministerials where there are 20 other heads of state. It's one-on-one when you go to countries. He hasn't been able to do that. He's an intellectual who has strayed into politics. I don't think he's a people person in quite the same way.
What do you think of his team?
I think that he has it's a pretty good team. I think, you could always quibble, but here's how I'd put it. He's got probably the best Secretary of Defense in American history.
Some say exactly.
Think about that.
That's right.
And the only competition comes from Robert Lovett. Hillary Clinton has proved to be a surprisingly good Secretary of State. I say surprisingly because, it wasn't what she lived and breathed for most of her career. But what she has decided to do is recognize that she is probably not the president's key strategic advisor, but she has become America's great spokesperson around the world, America's great salesman. I was with her in Kenya once. We did a town hall meeting together. She was fantastic, much better than any Secretary of State I've seen, because she's a politician and she's incredibly bright and she's very well briefed. So she could talk about Kenyan land reform and agricultural policy, and she had the audience eating out of her hand. The White House, I think Tom Donilon, the Deputy National Security Advisor, runs a very tight, well-coordinated ship. So I think on the whole it's better than people realize. You notice that there isn't, even from the Republican right, that much criticism of Obama's foreign policy, and that tells you something. Yeah.
Let me talk quickly about Afghanistan, though. I mean, you heard Rich Armitage and others have said, you know, they're not sure what the definitions of winning are. They're not sure what the goal is, because it's very broad. They're not sure how you can create the kind of policy they want. What they want, clearly, is an Afghanistan government on its own that can withstand the Taliban and not be a haven for al-Qaeda. That's it. And they want to build civil institutions that will enable them to do that.
That's pretty much it. I think the reality is, as long as we can get some level of stability in Afghanistan, which means an Afghan government that, broadly speaking, has legitimacy and the ability to control its borders, you can say that you have accomplished something and start leaving. Anything more, Charlie, you have to remember, this is the third poorest country in the world that has been ravaged by 30 years of civil war and has deep ethnic and tribal divisions within it. If we're going to stay and wait until it becomes, you know, France, we're going to be spending a long time. Again, here, I don't understand why people are in a haste to cut and run. I mean, we have a plan. The idea is, you know, General Petraeus has another year to try and regain some momentum, to beat the Taliban back, and then we start withdrawing. Fundamentally, we have got to get into the 21st century. America's future is not going to depend upon what happens in the mountains of Afghanistan. It's going to depend on what happens in Asia as China is rising. It is becoming an economic and strategic competitor. We have to have a cooperative relationship with them and yet hedge in the way that we need to by building relations with India, with Japan, with Australia. That is the cockpit of power, of great power politics in the 21st century. We're stuck in the 8th century trying to adjudicate between Sunnis and Shias.
But do we have an option? I mean, do we have a...
Yes.
We could not do it?
We can scale back. I think that I always thought that Biden's plan made a lot of sense. And people say, well, we wouldn't have as good intelligence if we weren't there in the numbers we are. Fine. You know, maybe you give up a little bit. There is no perfect solution here. But the idea that you need to have 150,000 troops in Afghanistan in perpetuity until you can achieve some perfect counterinsurgency strategy, for what?
Do you see some growing sort of sense that this is, as you suggested, a war of another century? This is not where America's energy and application ought to be.
Oh, I think the country has moved on. I think absolutely.
And basically saying to the president, get this over with.
Yes, and I think, you know, all those people around the world who think that we're the great imperialists, I always tell them, if only you lived in America, you'd realize the average American wants nothing better than to get the hell out of the world.
You wrote a book.
The Rise of the Rest. It was called The Post-American World.
And the Rise of the Rest of Us. All right. Is the dimension of the world today different than it was when you wrote that book, 2 years ago, 3 years ago? We have seen China go through changes, continue to grow, to continue to have relationships around the world, economic relationships. We have seen China refuse to be engaged in any kind of serious sanctions against Iran.
I think when I wrote that book, I was envisioning the rise of a post-American world and the rise of the rest, and it was going to take a decade. The financial crisis dramatically accelerated the forces I was describing. And you do see a world that's quite different. It has been transformed in mostly, I mean, there's the economic reality that we all know. All the growth in the world practically today is coming out of the emerging markets. That's why American companies are doing so well. The secret behind American companies doing well is they get cheap capital here, they find cheap labor somewhere else, and they all sell into emerging markets. That is where 50% of the growth of the
emerging markets means China and India, Indonesia, and
Brazil, South Africa. They're all growing over 5%. Turkey is growing 11%
for a quarter.
Yeah,
for a quarter.
But the big change is one of mentality. What I've been struck by is you go to China, I was there last month, and they now think that they understand how to run things, how to run their economy better than we do. So what Chinese officials said to me, you know, Hank Paulson used to come to us when he was at Goldman Sachs and when he was Treasury Secretary and tell us, you, the Chinese, need to make your financial system more like ours, the Americans. And then he paused and he said, I don't think we'll be getting those speeches anymore. And they look back to 10 years and they say, look, during the boom years, we raised interest rates. We tightened credit so that we kept things under control. And then when the wheel turned, we were able to ease up on credit. We were able to lower interest rates. We were able to spend money. We did the right thing. The Americans did it all wrong. So there's a real sense of Chinese confidence, maybe even Chinese arrogance right now.
As the Soviet Union fell apart, we didn't do very much, and Brzezinski's written a book about this, to create a new world. True?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
We now look at a period in which we know China, rather than falling apart, is growing and will be the dominant economic power. What is the strategic imperative for the United States, knowing that reality?
So if you look at every great power rise in history, and this was actually what my dissertation was about many years ago, every time you've had a great power rise, it has disrupted the international system. The rise of Germany, the rise of Japan, the rise of Russia, the Soviet Union, because you can't find a way for it to fit into the existing order, so it tries to overturn the existing order. The one exception was the rise of the United States in the late 19th century. And that worked because Britain decided as a matter of policy it was going to strategically find a way to accommodate and partner with the United States. So I think what we have to ask ourselves is there a path here where the United States and China can achieve enough strategic partnership that the global system stays stable? Because otherwise, if you end up with a strategic rivalry between the United States and China, whether it is the largest economy in the world or just the second largest economy, you are going to have a very different world than the world you and I are living in now. It will be a world more like the Cold War. It will be a world where countries will have to pick sides. There will be proxy fights. There will be, arms races. And that means a very different world from the kind of happy world of globalization that we have come to expect.
Thank you for coming. It's great to see you.